Good morning, everyone. And please feel free to enjoy your food where I'm talking. It's okay. And I'm Kathy Liu, and on behalf of the Purdue Center for Center on Aging and Life course, I want to welcome all of you, either in person or from our Zoom. We have Zoom audience for joining us today for the 2023 CALC Symposium. So each year, we choose a different topic. And this year, we focus on enhancing physical activity and improving physical function in later life. And we choose this topic because it fits the faculty-associated expertise, and also it addresses one of the most urgent public health priorities, both nationally and also in the state. Some of you may know or may not know, and actually Indiana performed very poorly in terms of physical activity. And Indiana is ranked 39 out of 50 states in the US for older adults being physically inactive. And 35% of the older adults in Indiana reported no exercise or any physical activity other than just a regular job in the past 30 days. So certainly this is a topic very timely, especially in Indiana here. And we know maintaining physical activity is very important for many health conditions, for many health outcomes. And we all know this, but there are also a lot of questions we don't know about physical activity that need to be addressed in the scientific research community. And today we are here to explore and stay up to latest research on this topic from some of our top scholars in the field. I'm sure all of us will learn a lot from today's discussion. I'm sure I will. Okay, so I would like to thank many people for putting together, for their support and hard work putting together all these things for make today's symposium possible. And first, I would like to thank our sponsor, the Department of Health and Kinesiology, and their department head, Professor Tim Gavin, for their generous sponsorship for this event today. And I would also like to thank our program committee this year and for their dedication to putting together all the entire agenda for today's event. And for this year, the program committee includes Professor Wayne Camper, Professor Chad Carroll, and also our graduate student, Bong Hing Ro, and Destiny Mayer, Ogo, and who else? I'm sorry. Heizu Ro, sorry. And last but not least, Miss Paige Abner. And Paige is actually the person who facilitated the whole process. Thank you so much, Paige, for this wonderful job. And okay, without further ado, I will invite Professor Chad Carroll to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Chad.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. I'm really excited to have Dr. Roger Fielding here to speak. He was kind of a unanimous choice between Dr. Campbell and myself for this occasion. And just kind of brief introduction. I have, even though we never overlapped, but we have some connection. We both have our master's degree from Ball State University, the Human Performance Lab, at different times. We won't get into dates or anything. Dr. Fielding received his PhD in nutrition at Tufts, and now he's currently at Tufts. Very long, I won't read all the titles, but one of us, he's a team lead and senior scientist for the Nutrition and Exercise Physiology and Sarcopenia, Gene Mayer, USDA Human Nutrition Research Center at Tufts. along with being a professor of nutrition there and various other capacities. His research is focused on mechanisms of aging-associated declines in muscle mass, or sarcopenia, and explores essentially various therapies to attenuate that process: exercise, of course, nutrition, and things of that nature. Has 250 peer-reviewed publications as of the most recent information that I have. Has been funded by many different agencies over the years, NIH, USDA, and foundations, and has been recognized with numerous awards over his career. So we're very excited to have him here and present some of his research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chad. And I really want to thank Chad and Wayne Campbell for this really nice invitation. I was really honored to be able to accept this, and so thank you for having me. Is there a pointer? And then I guess the question is, how do we advance the slides? Here we go. Thanks. Oh, thank you. Thank you. So just a few disclosures of people I talk to and where I beg money from. Just a very brief summary of what I hope to cover and talk about today. I think I'm going to try to give you an understanding, at least about what our current understanding of sarcopenia is. And it's not, I think there's not just one definition of sarcopenia. I think that's one of the things you'll learn. But I think we're striving towards a consensus about what this syndrome is and how important it is for people as they get older. So, looking at sort of the differences between consensus-based definitions and more evidence-based definitions of sarcopenia, and then talk a little bit about several different therapeutic interventions, mostly focused on differences in lifestyle that may be important for either reversing or attenuating this syndrome of sarcopenia. So I think as a center and as a group of investigators, and maybe the community that's here as well, you're probably well aware that there is a tremendous demographic transition going on in the United States and worldwide. We as a society are aging, so this is just sort of a heat map looking at the proportion of older individuals across the world in 2014 over the age of 50 comparing to 2050. So more red is more people over the age of 50. And it's very clear that you can see that not only in modernized, more Western developed countries is this transitioning happening, but even in low and moderate income countries, this transition towards an older society is occurring. And I think many of us are aware, concerned, interested in what the societal, healthcare, and economic impacts of this transition are going to be. And I think we have to take as many steps as possible to be prepared for this. It's happening now, and some of these things are happening now, but I think we have to be aware and be able to address this huge transition towards an older society. The other thing that's important, and I think that's sometimes overlooked, is that the largest, fastest growing segment of the older population are individuals over the age of 80 years. So not only are we overall aging, we have many more people living into their 80s and 90s than ever before in the history of the world. So I think we have to be aware and think about that. The way I have always been sort of thinking about and been interested in muscle and aging is really that I believe that muscle dysfunction and loss really affects people's mobility. And this is just census data from the United States looking at the syndrome of mobility disability in the United States. And the latest data is that among individuals over the age of 65 that live in the community, about 39% of them self-report that they have difficulty walking or climbing stairs. And about 10 million of those people report that they cannot walk a quarter of a mile or they cannot climb stairs. So I would say that this is a silent but very important sort of epidemic among our older adults in the United States and likely to be worldwide as well. We don't talk a lot about mobility. We don't hear a lot about it. So I thought it was really interesting, just about over a year ago now, prior to Queen Elizabeth's death, that the reports in the press weren't about her suffering from any specific disease and condition that was preventing her from attending her usual sort of functions and sort of events, but they were really reporting about the fact that she had continuing issues with her mobility. She actually missed the Highland Games, which is this big event in Scotland, because she really was struggling with issues related to her ability to get around. So this shortly preceded her death at age 96, but I think it just highlights again this issue about worsening mobility with advancing age. Now, I'd like to believe and do believe that skeletal muscle is the underlying substrate for some of these age-related declines in mobility. And for some of the audience that's maybe not a physiologist or a biologist, I think it's important to remember that our muscles are a big part of what we are. This is a tissue that makes up 40 to 50% of our total body mass. So a lot of what we are is muscle. Muscle plays a fundamental role in energy metabolism and oxygen consumption, locomotive activity, and substrate turnover and storage. So all the metabolism that goes on our bodies is largely occurring in muscle. Muscle is also a secretory organ, so it pumps out a lot of important factors and proteins, growth factors that really can affect not only the local muscle environment, but other tissues. It can increase its energy utilization somewhere around tenfold, so it has this very dynamic ability to respond and consume energy. And its contractile performance, its ability to generate force and power can really occur over about 100-fold range during activities of daily living. So a pretty cool, pretty dynamic tissue, and really important for us as we get older. We talk about things like ways of measuring sort of muscle function like force, power, and fatigue. These are overlapping constructs, but I would argue that they do represent some very distinct physiological properties within muscle. So they're not the same thing. They're highly correlated. And this becomes important, too, I think, when we're trying to understand what components of muscle function we want to measure when we're trying to identify those components of muscle performance that are important for people as they get older. Is it strength? Is it power? Is it fatigue? What are the things that contribute to declines in function in people as they age? It's also interesting to me that this motor function is very highly conserved across the kingdom. Whether you're an insect, a bird, a fish, a dog, or a man, it's all the same very highly conserved proteins that are responsible for force generation and movement, which is really interesting biology, I think. And also interesting that across a number of different species, probably all species, I think in worms as well, that with aging, there are well quantified declines in motor performance, whether you're a fruit fly or a Drosophila, whether you're a rodent, a rat, or a mouse, or you're a human. You can see these well-described declines in the Drosophila. It sort of manifests by their inability to fly as they age. In rats, this is a summary sort of performance scale that relates to survival in these animals. So animals that have a better performance on this scale live longer than animals that have worse performance. And in humans, the best data, I think, on this is a pooled meta-analysis of over 20,000 older men and women looking at the relationship between simply just habitual walking speed, how fast a person walks across a very short course, and their mortality. So higher walking speeds in both men and women are linked to better survival. So motor performance declines over the lifespan and is related to survival, particularly in older humans. So that to me suggests that there's a biological basis for this, so there's some underlying biology that's probably taking place across all these different organisms. And to sort of re-emphasize that, we did some interesting work in a fairly large cross-sectional study of older adults. We've been interested in the role that cellular senescence plays on tissues with advancing age. I have a very active collaboration with my colleague Nathan Lebrasser at the Mayo Clinic. Just a brief primer on cellular senescence. In all tissues as they age, there is a subpopulation of cells that develops this senescent phenotype. So these are senescent cells. Sometimes in the press, they're called zombie cells. I don't really like the zombie term, but anyway, you'll see that in the press occasionally. And these cells, really in response to different proteotoxic and genotoxic stresses, develop a very distinct phenotype that results in them stopping growing and dividing, but there's also some anti-apoptotic features. So they don't die. They survive, but they are in this state of growth arrest. So they stop dividing. And when they do that, they also start to secrete this very measurable senescence-associated secretory phenotype. So they secrete or they pump out a bunch of stuff from the cells, a bunch of bad stuff, essentially. So they pump out bioactive molecules that are inflammatory, growth factors, matrix remodeling proteins, and other chemokines and cytokines. So senescent cells pump out these factors. And what Nathan and his group at Mayo Clinic have done is they've developed some blood-based biomarkers of many of these proteins that are secreted into the circulation during cellular senescence. And what we were able to do was look very carefully at the measures of these senescence factors and relate them to, in this case, muscle weakness by this hand grip strength test. And we can see that high levels of many of these senescence factors are related to muscle weakness or low muscle strength. And we also were able to look at several measures of physical performance, walking ability to get up out of a chair, and a simple standing balance test, and could show very nicely that some of these same senescence factors were highly expressed in individuals that had very low levels of physical functioning. And actually, we developed a predictive model of this with the top 10 sort of based senescence factors, and actually showed that it was a very sensitive and specific test for poor physical performance on this composite measure of physical functioning called the short physical performance battery. So we think that these 10 biomarkers of senescence are highly sensitive and highly specific for identifying individuals that have poor physical performance. So I think the bottom line here is I think that there is a biological basis for some of these changes we see in motor function and physical functioning with advancing age. This idea that we lose muscle with aging is not something that's really very new. The sort of physician and philosopher Maimonides sort of highlighted the fact that, there's wasting that's associated with old age, there's wasting that's associated with fever, and there's wasting that they called at the time dolgashi, which I think means sort of starvation or poor diet. So even back in the 11th, 12th century, I think people were understanding a little bit that there was this age-associated muscle wasting, cachexia, and starvation that caused losses in muscle. The sort of first modern sort of data and evidence about this really came from the nuclear research program at Los Alamos, showing using this technique of measuring total body potassium. Now, if you remember, potassium is an ion, as a molecule that's largely inside cells. In fact, our bodies use a lot of energy to make sure that we keep all the potassium in our cells and not too much potassium outside of our cells. So if you can measure all the potassium that's in your body, it's mostly a reflection of how much potassium you have in all your cells. And that's really mostly a measure of how much muscle you have. So if you look at this, you can see very nicely, this is data from the 1950s. In men and women, there's a nice increase in total body potassium or muscle during growth and development. And guess what happens? It declines in both sexes with advancing age. Now, not a lot of subjects in this study, but remember, this was in the 1950s, and it's a really kind of cool example of how a byproduct of the nuclear industry could really kind of inform some of the science that we're even thinking about today. more recently, this is data from the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging, the BLSA, which is a very important longitudinal cohort study that still exists today and is supported by the National Institute of Aging. You can see this is CT scan of the lower extremity and measures of lower extremity muscle strength. You can see that muscle size or muscle cross-sectional area by CT declines with advancing age at a rate of about 0.5 to 1% per year. This is up to about age 85. So from age 20 to 85, we're talking about a 25%, approximately 25% loss in muscle cross-sectional area or muscle size. And you can see that that corresponds to about a 2 to 3% per year decline in muscle strength or muscle force generation over that same period of time. So this is a bit more modern look at this age-related decline in muscle mass and also the added information about changes in muscle strength. I think it's important to note that the loss or the changes in muscle strength are about twice the changes that we observe in muscle cross-sectional area or muscle size. And this data has been reproduced in different ways as well. Now, the first idea of this term being called, this loss in muscle being called sarcopenia was first sort of presented by a colleague and friend of ours, Irv Rosenberg, back in the late 80s. He thought that this loss in muscle mass with aging was sort of important, and it really needed a name. So he came up with this term sarcopenia that's important and published, this term was published in a sort of obscure monograph that's not kind of hard to find and not so well cited all the time. But the first published use of the term sarcopenia that I could find actually comes from Purdue's own Wayne Campbell. This was actually in the peer-reviewed Journal of Nutrition in 1993, where they really rigorously try to understand and talk about sarcopenia and age-related changes in body composition and functional capacity. I don't think this paper always gets the credit that it deserves, so I just wanted to highlight it today. And I think this was really an important step. And I think until we sort of named this syndrome something, I think it tended to be kind of ignored and overlooked. And I think we really still need to put more emphasis on this idea of sarcopenia and really studying it. So now we're sort of at this point where we think of sarcopenia not just as maybe the loss in muscle mass or size. We sort of have incorporated this idea that it's also really this age-associated loss in muscle mass and function. We generally think that this is a syndrome characterized by progressive generalized loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength, with the subsequent risk of adverse outcomes such as physical disability, poor quality of life, and death. And there's emerging data on how various components of muscle mass and function are related to these clinically important distal sort of outcomes. More recently, there's even been an establishment of a billing code in the ICD-10 for sarcopenia, which I think is necessary if we're going to develop treatments and get reimbursed for them. It's not widely subscribed or widely used, but it is in the ICD-10 codes as of 2016. I think there's general agreement that sarcopenia really has these three components: changes in muscle mass or size, declines in muscle strength, or maybe muscle performance is a better term, and some effects on physical performance or physical functioning. There's been a number of worldwide efforts to try to define this syndrome. I think I've participated in just about all these except the one that was done in Europe. They kind of ignored the Americans, but that's okay. And so when we think about these components and we think about these consensus, these are kind of the components that everybody sort of talks about. Having some measure of muscle mass, muscle size, or lean mass. These are the three major ones that have been used in the literature and in clinical trials and studies. I don't want to go through this in great detail, only to say that DEXA, or dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, is a technique that is widely available largely because it's used to treat and diagnose osteoporosis. So virtually every major hospital and medical center and many research facilities have a DEXA scanner. So it can also measure soft tissue attenuation. It can measure lean tissue and fat tissue. So it's used widely. There's some question about what you're actually measuring with the DEXA scanner. It's measuring lean tissue or total body water. So while a major component of that is muscle, not all of the lean body mass is muscle. And I think that's why some other techniques may be more advantageous as we proceed forward. CT and MRI are more valid imaging techniques, measure very direct properties of muscle, either with radiation or with a magnetic spin here. And these are measuring direct physical properties of the muscle, either cross-sectional area, and as we saw in one of the posters this morning, the actual volume of muscle within a particular region of the body or muscle group. All of these techniques are highly precise and have been shown to be sensitive to change in clinical trial. They differ by sort of the underlying assumptions of what they're actually measuring and the analytical approaches and probably the cost as well, from least expensive here with DEXA to most expensive with MRI. So that's one of the components that we think about. There are some new methodologies to measure muscle mass, and I think these may be very promising in the future. One of them is to use this isotopically labeled creatine dilution approach. So this is D3 creatine. So this is a stable isotope of creatine. Creatine is largely an intracellular compound, largely in muscle. So you can take a dose of creatine, wait a while, a couple of days, and then take a urine sample and measure the appearance of this D3 label in creatinine in the urine. And it's reported to be a direct measure of muscle mass. I don't think there's a direct measure of anything, so I think it's maybe a more accurate measure of a more accurate indirect measure of muscle mass. And certainly the idea here is that this is the lean body mass that you see when you measure DEXA, and it's only a component of this really that's muscle. And when you just measure the muscle using D3 creatine, maybe you're really getting a better understanding of how this actual muscle tissue may relate to other sort of measures, more distal measures like strength and physical functioning. And actually what Bill Evans and Peggy Cawthon did in a really nice cross-sectional study was they looked at how well muscle mass by the D3 creatine dilution actually predicted self-reported mobility limitations. And it actually does a very good job. In other words, individuals that have low muscle mass by D3 creatine report difficulty in many of these activities of daily living. Compared to when you look at lean mass by DEXA, you really don't see a relationship between lean mass by DEXA and self-reported limitations in physical functioning. So I think this technique may have promise. I think it needs to be better validated. It needs to be done in more women. We need to know how sensitive it is to change and whether it's really operating under some of the appropriate underlying assumptions of any sort of isotopically labeled tracer technique. And then finally, when we look at components of strength, we're usually talking about measuring things like strength or maximum force generating capacity, which is really the maximal ability of a muscle group to generate force or tension. This is measured many different ways, but I would also want to just note that we use grip strength or isometric grip strength as a measure of strength in many of the epidemiological studies just because it's been used and it's been implanted in many epi studies. So we have a tremendous amount of data available on isometric grip strength. It doesn't mean that it's the best measure of strength, but it's pervasive in the epidemiological literature. So I think it's been used a lot to sort of understand the relationship between muscle weakness and some of these important clinically significant distal outcomes. Power is also important. This is the maximum rate of force generating capacity per unit time. So we're talking about more explosive movements. And you can think that those may be really important for some functional activities as well. And then to close this out, we talk about muscle fatigue or the inability to maintain a given force output. And again, these are highly correlated. They're overlapping constructs, but I don't think physiologically they are exactly the same thing. So I think sometimes we get into the habit of using strength and power and fatigue interchangeably when in fact they're really not the same thing. And I think that various of these measures may help to inform how we think about muscle dysfunction with aging and how that really relates to physical functioning and disability in older people. And then finally, this last component of sarcopenia really relates to physical performance or physical function. There are a number of highly precise, standardized measures of this, including measuring simple gait speed across a short course. There are walking tests like the 400-meter walk, the 6-minute walk test. These all have validated, clinically important differences that have been ascribed to them using anchor-based methodologies. So if someone improves 25 meters or 50 meters on the 6-minute walk, it clinically means something. It's not just statistically different. And some composite measures here, the short physical performance battery test, this is a composite measure of physical functioning, and the stair climbing task as well. So that kind of rounds out the way I think now we're thinking about how we will sort of determine who has sarcopenia and who doesn't. There have been a number of consensus definitions, as I mentioned. I don't want to spend a lot of time on these in detail, but just to show you that since 2010, we've sort of progressed from thinking about this based on expert opinion. What do you think sarcopenia is? What do I think sarcopenia is? Well, it's this, to really starting to look at, use the epidemiological literature that's available to develop a more evidence-based definition of sarcopenia. I think one of the successful stories here more recently was the Sarcopenia Definitions and Outcomes Consortium, which I did participate in. This was led by Shally Basine at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Peggy Cawthon at UCSF. And they didn't come out with a consensus definition. They used large pooled epidemiological meta-analysis of about 25,000 older men and women. What they did is they just came out with some position statements. And I think the most important ones that they came out with, we came out with, I guess, that was both that weakness defined by low grip strength and slowness defined by low usual gait speed, again, muscle performance, physical performance, should be included in the definition of sarcopenia. The other thing that I think was important in this large epidemiological analysis was every way they tried to look at the data, really, we could not show that lean mass really added anything to this ability to predict bad clinical outcomes in this large pooled cohort of older adults. So we at the time, and this was met with some reluctance and resistance, that lean mass measured by DEXA should not really be included in the definition of sarcopenia. So I think the evidence base now is that weakness is important and low physical functioning, at least defined by slowness, is important. That doesn't mean that muscle mass and declines in muscle mass aren't important for aging and aren't important for sarcopenia and the results of sarcopenia. I just don't think we have robust enough techniques to detect how much that contributes to sort of whether someone loses their mobility, whether someone has a fall or a fracture. And just to show you some of the data from the SDoc, this is data in women from this pooled analysis. And you can see that when you look at falls, mobility limitations, mortality, and hip fractures, it's the combination, it's weakness plus slow gait speed that really increases the relative risk of any of these bad distal outcomes. So I think there's some consolidation of a sort of a definition of sarcopenia around weakness and poor physical functioning. We still have to kind of harmonize this across the world, across the continents. We're working on this. I think this is just an example of the different cut points for weakness that have been proposed by different working groups. FNIH, this is the SDoc data. This is the data from the European Working Group. And the reality is, depending on how severe you want to call the weakness, the data is fairly similar. And I think this just makes me think that I'm encouraged, but that I think we can get to a point where we have one universal cut point for weakness and one universal cut point for weakness in both men and women. And we're nearing that point. So I think out of a lot of discourse about sarcopenia, we are nearing kind of a consensus definition. I think in the community, there's a lot of people that still don't know what this is. This was a survey that was done by Jack Koralnik that we helped him with, where they asked different practitioners what their familiarity was with the term sarcopenia, and then they also queried what specialty they practiced in. And you can see the responses here were, in the dark, from very familiar to not familiar at all. You can see that there's some lack of familiarity in internal medicine about sarcopenia, also in family medicine. Fortunately, I think in geriatrics, much more familiarity about sarcopenia, and also in PM&R, physical medicine and rehabilitation. But I think we can do better about this. I think we need to do better about this if we're really going to get people concerned about mobility problems and concerned about sarcopenia. I think we have to increase awareness of sarcopenia among the medical community. And I think we also have to increase awareness about sarcopenia among older adults. I mean, I think older people don't understand that when they have trouble climbing stairs or walking, that they have a problem with their muscles or they have sarcopenia. I think when they have joint pain, they know they have arthritis. Maybe when they have chest pain, they know they probably should get to the emergency room pretty quickly. But I don't think when they're having trouble getting around or walking, climbing stairs, I don't think they really understand that they have trouble with their muscles. And we have to do a better job of educating people about that, for sure. Lots of things, like many syndromes of aging, many things cause sarcopenia, changes in activity, changes in dietary intake, probably some of the senescence proteins, increased inflammation, declines in many of the pro-anabolic hormones, and also clearly some of the changes in neuromuscular activation and neuromuscular function that occur with advancing age. So while this is daunting, it can be many things, it's also encouraging because I think it means that there's numerous therapeutic targets that you can go after to potentially attenuate or correct these changes in skeletal muscle, or this syndrome of sarcopenia with aging. Just want to talk briefly about some of the lifestyle interventions that may attenuate or reverse some of the changes in muscle that are associated with sarcopenia. The ones that I know the most about are things related to physical activity, exercise, and some nutritional interventions. I'll just show you some examples of some studies that are in the literature and that we've done, and also just talk a little bit about the fact that there is a very active program in pharma trying to develop medicines that target skeletal muscle and that may be useful in treating muscle-related syndromes like sarcopenia. And I'll sort of end with that. Because I think whether you're a practitioner, you're a clinician, whether you're an exercise physiologist or a nutritionist, I think it's a good idea to have some awareness of the sort of emerging pharmacotherapies that are being developed in this area. Because I think we may be in the same situation with diabetes, like with hyperlipidemia, is that we're talking about combinations of treatments. It's not just exercise, it's not just diet, it's diet, exercise, and maybe metformin, or diet and exercise and atorvastatin. So I think the same thing is going to reveal itself in sarcopenia, maybe not in the next year or two, but in the future. So first of all, resistance training or strength training is probably the most potent stimulus for skeletal muscle growth and hypertrophy. And I always like to have this slide in here because, again, we talk about resistance training and strength training, and we always sometimes mean different things. Skeletal muscle responds and adapts to loading conditions. Strength and resistance training really, high force, high power outputs activities induce hypertrophy. If you stop activity, low force activities, inactivity, bed rest, zero gravity, it induces muscle atrophy or muscle wasting, sort of the principles of overload for muscle. When we talk about strength or resistance training, we're usually talking about people exercising 2 to 3 sessions per week, engaging the large major muscle groups of the upper and lower extremities. This magic 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions. I don't know if that's the best or that's the right thing to do, but that's sort of what we tell everybody to do. Probably other modes and sequences are better. And for sure, I think it's important that the intensity be sufficiently high enough. And we really recommend, to really maximize strength gains and muscle growth or hypertrophy, that that the training be performed at an intensity that's sufficient enough to be close to what we think about as like 70 to 90% of an individual's maximum strength or maximum capacity, usually measured by this 1 repetition maximum or the 1 RM. And if you don't want to measure your 1 RM, if you're doing 8 to 10 repetitions and you feel like you can't do 11, you're probably pretty close to being at 70 or 70 to 90% of your 1 repetition maximum. So you don't have to remeasure it all the time. And these are just some examples of how to do this. You can effectively use exercise bands, weight machines, handheld weights. I've used all of these, they work. You can do calisthenic exercises, they work. And even heavy work in the house or the yard counts as well. And even some aspects of yoga and Tai Chi, not all of them, but some of them have sufficient loading characteristics, I think, to be considered strength or resistance training. Just to show you what happens when you resistance train, this is pretty old data, but from Tufts, so I thought I'd share it. This was 1 year of progressive resistance training in healthy postmenopausal women. They trained for a year twice a week or were randomized to an attention control group. They got a health education program. And you can see pretty clearly that there were dramatic changes in the exercise group over the year in 1 repetition maximum muscle strength for all the major muscle groups that were trained. And along with that, a pretty robust increase in total body lean mass measured by DEXA here of about a little over 1 kilogram in the exercise group, and the group that got health education over the same year period lost about 0.5 kilogram. That difference is similar to what you would see in a pro-myogenic drug therapy if you gave that to older women. So I think the effects of resistance training are pretty potent and pretty robust, at least in healthy older women. We did a study more recently when I was at the lab looking at resistance exercise training in older adults with poor mobility. So these individuals at baseline had a number of comorbidities, and they had poor physical performance on this composite measure of physical functioning. And we were still able to show that they can have. This was 12 weeks of training, progressive resistance training in red compared to a flexibility control group in black here. They were able to significantly increase their strength, their peak power, and we were also able to show that their muscle fatigue characteristics also improved with this 12 weeks of training. So robust effects on strength and mass and fatigue capacity with resistance training. A little bit more evidence-based approach was applied in this large randomized controlled trial, phase 3 trial of looking at a more multimodal exercise intervention, some aerobic plus resistance training exercise. This was a structured walking program and a fairly low intensity resistance training program. But again, in a more real world setting, this was the Lifestyle Independence for Elders trial. We randomized over 1,600 older adults across 8 clinical centers in the United States. This was the largest trial of physical activity and exercise that has ever been undertaken in the US, and it's because of the cost, it will probably never ever be repeated. And we were actually really nicely able to follow these individuals in this study for almost 3 years. The range was about 2 to 4 years, depending on when they were randomized into the trial. And we were really comparing the effects of this multimodal exercise intervention compared to an attention health education control group. Just to show you that this was not a completely healthy group, the average age here was about 79 years, so fairly older cohort that we studied. Primarily female, that's typical for our studies, and the average BMI here was about 30, so virtually everybody in the study was overweight or obese. And they all had a number of comorbidities and a number of medications. Polypharmacy was highly prevalent. So this was not by any means a healthy older group. This was a more, I think, usual or representative group of older adults. And I think we had a fair representation of African Americans, Hispanic in the study as well. Although that varied by clinical site, which were scattered across the US. The primary outcome for this study was the development, I just want to explain this very quickly, was the development of the onset of major mobility disability. Well, what does that mean? So at baseline, Everybody had to be able to complete the 400-meter walking distance. We measured their ability to walk 400 meters in a course in the lab. And basically, we followed them every 6 months. And when they met the primary outcome when they were no longer able to complete the 400-meter walk. So we did this every 6 months. And what you can see is that those individuals that were randomized to the physical activity group, fewer of those individuals developed the inability to walk 400 meters compared to the individuals who were randomized to the health education control group. Looking at the hazard ratios here, there was about an 18% reduction in the development of the inability to walk 400 meters in individuals that were randomized to physical activity compared to control. This was statistically significant. So really significant, important, I think, meaningful impact on prevention of mobility disability with exercise and physical activity in this at-risk older population. Back to the biology. This is the clicker. We also, more recently, actually, were able to look at the senescence biomarkers in this study, and we were able to show that a panel of these senescence biomarkers were actually related and predictive of the onset of major mobility disability. So these were the top biomarkers here, with activin A being the top one here, VEGF, TNFR1, the MMP is a matrix metalloproteinase, GDF15, which is a big player right now in a lot of the aging biomarker space. These were all by quartile of concentration. Higher activin A, higher VEGF, higher TNFR1, higher MMP were all associated with a greater onset of major mobility disability. We also looked at persistent mobility disability, which meant that you failed the 400-meter walk at one test. When you came back 6 months later, you failed it again. So maybe a little bit more measure of reserve capacity. And again, very similar panel of these senescence biomarkers related to this. We did look at the effects of the senescence biomarkers on how they changed with the physical activity intervention. And overall, there was no significant effect of exercise on changing any of these senescence proteins. But we also did an additional analysis. And when we looked at levels of physical activity participation, irrespective of whether people were assigned to the physical activity group or the health education group, we were able to show that individuals in the highest quartile of physical activity participation measured directly by accelerometry. So they wore accelerometer every 6 months during the intervention, 7 days, so we could measure all of their activity. There was a relationship between decline in several of these senescence biomarkers and higher levels of physical activity. This was at the 12-month measurement, and this was at the 24-month measurement. So while there was no direct effect of the physical activity intervention on changes in any of these senescence markers that we measured, when we did look at levels of physical activity, irrespective of assignment to health education or physical activity, there was an association between level of physical activity and decline in some of these markers of senescence. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to just skip over this nutrition study, which is important, but I don't want to take too much time. Just mention very quickly, along with these lifestyle interventions, there is an emergent program in pharma looking at pharmacologic agents that could potentially target sarcopenia, and I think it's important to know about them. Some of the classes of agents that are being evaluated now are the selective androgen receptor modulators. These are very much like testosterone, except they're more specific and are more specifically targeted at skeletal muscle and have fewer of the off-target effects of testosterone. So these are the non-steroidal SARMs. There's several active programs looking at modulators of the myostatin protein. Myostatin is a negative regulator of muscle growth, so if you inhibit it or block its receptor, it induces muscle hypertrophy, or if you knock it out in mouse models, then you get large muscles. There have been a number of biologics that have been targeting myostatin pathways. That more recently, there have been modulators of neuromuscular function. One in particular is the skeletal troponin activators that actually increase the sensitivity of the troponin proteins to calcium so that for a given level of neuromuscular input, you get more force generation, so you get more force output without the need to induce muscle hypertrophy. So I think that is a novel approach to this. A number of different compounds that affect or activate or regulate mitochondrial biogenesis or mitochondrial stability. And then also a number of medicines that have been developed for other indications and dietary supplements that have either been approved or already marketed that are being evaluated with respect to their effects on muscle function. I think for everybody in the community, it's important to understand these because eventually some of these agents may have indications that are in conjunction with other therapies, whether it's rehabilitation after injury, surgery, fracture, with or without nutritional interventions. I think we need to be aware of these things that are also going on sort of under the radar a little bit now, but I think we'll hear more about them as they progress. So I just want to thank you for your attention. I think I've tried to summarize sort of what our current understanding of sarcopenia is, talk a little bit about the tools and how we've gotten to this state of how we assess sarcopenia, a little bit about the differing definitions and approaches to this, and some of the lifestyle interventions that may be important for targeting some of the components of sarcopenia. And I just want to end with this idea that, when we're talking about aging and healthy aging, I think we continue to need to make sure that we're not sort of giving this message that we're trying to necessarily extend lifespan, but really we want to develop and promote therapies and interventions that really extend health span and improve quality of life as people successfully age. So thank you again very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have to speak into a microphone, but thank you for such a great talk. So I have a couple of questions, but the one that I really wanted to ask is, have you looked into individuals' history of their regular physical activity prior to engaging in these physical activity interventions? And if so, do people who had a history of engaging in regular physical activity, did they react better to physical activity intervention versus who didn't?
Yeah, that's a great question. Generally, in our studies, we usually try to recruit individuals that are sedentary, at least within the last 6 months to a year, so they haven't engaged in much physical activity within the previous year. We don't know a lot, at least I don't know a lot about their sort of life history of physical activity and how that might impact their response to exercise training interventions. It's a good question. I suspect some people have looked at that. I just don't know. So can't really answer it. But we try to recruit people, and it's not a problem. Most older people are typically sedentary, at least the people that we've targeted in our studies. So good question.
Hi. Yes, that was a great talk. I had one question about one figure. Since it wasn't a number, I'm having to guess, but I believe it was one about the 400-meter completion. And when we looked across it, it would be easily pull that one back up. So you had the blue and the red lines. Oh, I'm sorry, they're running.
You want to see the slide?
Yeah, if that was possible, just because, yes. It's, I believe it was the 400-meter completion slide. It was back about 4 slides from here.
Yeah, if we can go back.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be creating all this. Back more. It's back to where we had the blue and the red, the figure right. Whoop, we just passed it. Forward one. Maybe back one. I'm sorry, I saw it go. There we go.
One.
Okay. And I was, that one, to me, was sort of glass half full, glass half empty, that I actually expected those who were assigned to physical activity that there would be much less reduction. I expected there would be almost like a almost straight, flat line across.
Like they would be
And-
like immune from everything, and they
Well-
would do really well.
Well, I guess I was hopefully thinking maybe physical activity would have more of an effect. So I was surprised that even though the differences between the two conditions were obviously significant, that I was still surprised that there wasn't a greater difference and there wasn't greater maintenance, of quality of activity that was provided. So were you surprised by this?
Well, no, because we've thought a lot about this. Two things I will say is, one is that this was a very representative, I think, older population. So they had a number of comorbidities, number of chronic conditions, multiple medications. And what's interesting is that in both groups, unrelated to the intervention, about the 1-year rates of hospitalization, for example, was about 50%. So these are people. A lot of these people were in and out of the hospital, coming back and forth into the interventions. And secondly, this was a fairly low intensity exercise intervention, and that was deliberate because we wanted to evaluate an exercise program or intervention that, if it was successful, and I think this was, that it would be scalable, so we could do it in a community center, and we've actually done that now. We've done a study where we've validated its use in a senior center, so that it didn't involve a lot of specialized weight equipment. It was fairly low intensity strength intervention. So I think both of those things may have contributed to, it's not a sort of, is this a sort of home run difference between physical activity and health education? 18% reduction in a large trial like this, it's comparable to other, fracture prevention with vitamin D, 20% reduction, I think. So we thought it was reasonable, but yeah, sure, we would have wished it was higher. But I think some of those things may have contributed.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fielding. This is a fantastic talk, very educational, very informative. And I have a question about the definition of the sarcopenia.
Yes.
And so it seems it's still in the process of developing a clear, definition, and people reach consensus. And in your slide, I see you have different definition for by gender. It seems women have a lower criteria, so that makes sense to me, the gender difference.
Yes.
And I actually wonder if people consider age, adjust age for the definition, because, we will expect, its decline, and whether you think the definition should be adjusted for age.
I'm not, I think the prevalence will vary with age for sure, but I'm not sure we want to necessarily assign different criteria or cut points by age, because I think the relative risk of, falls, fractures, mobility limitations is the same if you have weakness when you're 65 or when you're 75, or at least I suspect it is. And I also worry about having, we have too many definitions now, right? But I also worry about if there are way too many cut points that you need to use depending on age, sex, maybe body size or body mass. I just worry about that it's going to be very hard to implement that too. So from a practical standpoint, I'd be happy if we all agreed on one definition with one set of cut points. Sure, they need to be different between men and women, but I think that would be better, I think.
Roger, fantastic talk. Thanks so much, and thanks for coming. Tim Gavin. So you were talking about, in some of the definitions, not to get stuck there, but mass versus strength. Mm-hmm. And, I think we really talk a lot about power, right? We use examples frequently in our educations about the importance of power as we get older as well. So I was wondering if you could elucidate some of your thoughts there.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of work looking at muscle power in older adults, and I think when you think about it, just sort of without any data, if you think about it, what's important in terms of muscle function as you get older. So when you're walking, if you slip on the floor or you lose your balance, you need to generate a very quick counterbalance maneuver very, very quickly. So I think from a very practical standpoint, being able to generate force at a high velocity could make the difference between whether you fall or you don't fall. So I think that probably is important. Whether, power as a measure and as a construct is a better predictor of falls or a better predictor of who has poor physical functioning and who doesn't. We've done studies where when we look at strength and power in the same people, power always is a stronger predictor in terms of we do regression analysis. But is it that much better? They're highly correlated measures. I think power is important. I don't know if it's necessarily a better measure. The other problem is, we suffer from, sample size issues because a lot of the studies that have measured muscle power, they're not done in thousands and thousands of people. For that, we sort of are stuck with grip strength. So it's kind of a methodological thing. But personally, I think power is important. I don't think there's a whole lot of data saying that, yes, it absolutely is the most important thing to measure, and it's better than these other measures of muscle performance when we're talking about falls, fractures, things like that. Yes? Or are we done? Or do we still have time? Okay.
Oh, thank you for your wonderful talk. I was just wondering whether you've ever looked into the role of inflammation or oxidative stress in the development of sarcopenia.
Yeah, I haven't, but two things that are interesting there is there is good data in the literature from studies like the Inchianti study, which is a longitudinal cohort in Italy, showing that high levels of C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 are associated with mobility loss, poor physical performance with strength. And interestingly, some of these senescence biomarkers that I showed in the studies that we did in the life cohort, they are inflammatory cytokines. IL-6 is in the panel, TNF alpha, some of the TNF receptors. So, there is evidence, I think, there are inflammatory processes, I think, that are related to some of this dysfunction and decline in muscle with aging.
Thank you.
Roger, great talk, and thank you also for coming. I'm curious about when you make these measurements in these people. There's a lot of talk about, most of these measurements would be made either in a community setting at any time of a day, not necessarily just in the morning in a fasted state, or with whether or not they've exercised or been stressed in some way coming in. But I'm particularly interested in whether or not it's the basal state that will be a predictor, or whether or not it would be a better predictor to look for variabilities in the response to a challenge.
Yeah.
And my nutritional corollary there is glycemia and glucose control.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interest in the nutrition space about sort of, personalized responses to glycemia and things and meals and things like that. And probably that's true. I mean, I would say in the intervention trials that I talked about, things like time of day and, fasting were fairly well controlled, in those studies. In the epi studies that I don't know as much about, it may be more variable. And I think that not only is response to challenge important, but maybe also looking at sort of trajectories of decline. Like, if you fall, you measure someone, either strength or power or fatigue over 2 years or something like that. Is it the trajectory that's important? And it could be response to a challenge too. Like initially, before good imaging and things, my understanding was in the dementia world, to sort of get a good diagnosis of MCI or dementia, it was really looking at the trajectory of the change in sort of cognitive performance, as opposed to just looking at it at one point in time. So maybe that could be important here too, as well. So. Are we?
Yeah, Dr. Fielding, thank you very much.
Thank
I really
you so much,
appreciate it.
Dr. Campbell. Great. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome you back. What a great morning. Thank you for coming. I have the pleasure of being able to bestow an award today. Every year, the Center on Aging in the Life course gives an award, and it rotates across 3 areas: research, teaching, and engagement. This year, we're going to focus on teaching. And by teaching, we refer to instruction, learning, and mentorship. It's my pleasure to announce, and I know you saw it in the bulletin, that Mary Marshall is our recipient of the Outstanding Professor Award. Let me tell you a little bit about her, and then we'll call her up. Mary Marshall earned the dual title PhD here at Purdue in Human Development and Family Studies and Gerontology, and she's assistant professor of gerontology at California State University, Long Beach. From the start of her graduate studies at Purdue, Mary Marshall was squarely committed to research on aging and the field of gerontology, and she's been thrilled to join a department of gerontology, and we are really proud of that. She is an accomplished scholar whose research has been published in a variety of journals, including PLOS One, Journal of General Internal Medicine, Journal of Cancer Education and Family Relations. After completing 1 year at CSU Long Beach, she was awarded the Emerging Leader Award from the California Council on Gerontology and Geriatrics. Many of you may know about Tech Team that we do in the community, taking students out to residential facilities for older adults to help them with technological problems they're facing. And what you may not know, however, is that Mary Marshall was very instrumental in helping us to develop that program. In fact, she created the orientation model, the training model for that literally hundreds of undergraduate and graduate students have taken to help prepare them for interacting with older adults in that setting. At CSU Long Beach, sometimes referred to as the beach, she teaches courses to help students understand the multidisciplinary perspective on aging and topics such as dementia, end-of-life care, and social policy in an aging society. She served on 18 student committees, chaired 5 of those for dissertations or theses, and she's the advisor for the Gerontology Club on campus. She also involves her students in her research endeavors, from collecting data to publication. Okay, in the classroom, she is a rock star. She averages 5.9 out of 6, where 6 is the best, on a scale over the past 5 years, and so all of us are clearly envious of that. And let me share a few comments from her students in teaching evaluations. Professor Marshall is such an amazing professor. She gives amazing feedback and assignments and responds quickly to emails. She is by far the best professor I've had here at CSU-LB. She inspires me and supports me as well. The professor is great, and I love this class. I'm actually looking forward to going to grad school because of this class. Dr. Marshall always engaged with students and made sure to post updates on the class for us to view. She always emphasized that she was here to help and support us. And a theme that came through was that in teaching through a pandemic, she was notably helpful. Her colleagues evaluate her too, and they have high praise for her. They describe her as friendly and inviting, passionate and knowledgeable about the topic. Would you join me in congratulating Mary Marshall on the Outstanding Professor Award?
Oh my goodness. Thank you. Wow. I have just the place for this in my office. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I asked if I had a minute to make a quick remark because I just wanted to, I don't want this to fall and break, so let me put this down there. But don't let me forget it. Okay. I just wanted to make a quick remark because, you know, it's really wonderful to be back. I've really loved seeing campus and seeing familiar faces. But one thing I've noticed over, you know, the 5+ years that I've been gone is that there really is no place like CALC out there. I've worked with other universities and programs and colleagues, and when I describe CALC and the experiences I got here, they're all just so, you know, amazed by the opportunity that students and faculty have for interdisciplinary connections. So I just want to make sure you know that this is a really special and unique place. So I wanted to say that, and then I also wanted to tell the students, if any students are here, even if you're thinking of going to a more, you know, R1-based, you know, job in academia post-graduation, to still look into the incredible opportunities that CIE, which is the Center for Instructional Excellence, has on campus. I feel like the certificates and workshops that I did at CIE really helped me become a confident and comfortable teacher. So both of those things. And then there were many, you know, I was reflecting on my experiences here when I was told I was going to get this award, and my kind of journey to become an educator in my own way, as I, you know, have been at CSULB. And I reflected on kind of the qualities of teaching that I learned from my experiences here, from the professors here. And there were a lot, but I just wanted to share one that I think is really important and kind of stood out, and also the quotes that Ken chose to share from my students, is the importance of kind of developing that connection with your students as a teacher, really seeing them as humans and letting them see you as a human as well. And spending time to get to know them outside of being a student, them get to know you outside of being a teacher, and really connecting with them on that deeper level. And I think that one reason that that's important is that when you, as an educator, want to push your students to do more, do better, get outside their comfort zone, you know, push their knowledge in new ways, they will have the trust in you because you form that connection. They know you care about them. They know you care about their best interests. And so they have more buy-in to this idea of, you know, trying to do more, do better that, you know, you're pushing them to do. So I just wanted to share that that was one of the qualities I've taken with me from my professors here. And I really, really appreciate that I had the experiences I did here at Purdue. So thank you. Thank you so much. An experience of being in a, you know, more teaching forward or teaching focused school, I feel free to give you my email and we can chat about it, because I know when I was here sometimes you wanted to kind of talk through all your different options post graduation, so I'm available to discuss those things. So thank you. Thank you.
We are ahead of schedule. It's a notable day. Good morning, everyone. I'm Elliot Friedman. I'm faculty in the Department of Human Development and Family Science, and it is my privilege to introduce the 4 speakers from Purdue for this morning. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes to present, and that'll be followed by a 5-minute question and answer period, and we're just going to go right through the list of 4. So I'm going to introduce all 4, and then you'll never see me again. Our first speaker is Dr. Libby Richards, an associate professor in the School of Nursing and director of the PhD in nursing. Her areas of research include the role of social support in increasing and maintaining physical activity, community-based physical activity programming, and her topic for today, the timing of health behaviors for optimal health outcomes. Her research has been funded internally from Purdue's Center for Families, Cooperative Extension, and externally from the National Institutes of Health, the Indiana CTSI, and the American Nurses Foundation. Dr. Richards also serves a number of leadership positions, or has served a number of leadership positions in the field of public health, including as a board member of the Indiana Public Health Association, chair of the physical activity section of the American Public Health Association, and she is currently the chair for the Aging Research Interest Group for the International Society of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity. Our second speaker is Dr. Bruno Rosseghini, who's associate professor in the Department of Health and Kinesiology. He is interested in peripheral artery disease, and his research spans the distance between preclinical laboratory work and clinical trials of interventions to promote vascular function and physical health. He has earned support from the American Heart Association as well as the National Institutes of Health. And Dr. Russaghini and his team are examining the benefits specifically of heat therapy for peripheral circulation and physical function, including the clinical trial of unsupervised leg heating, which will be the topic of his presentation. Third, we have Dr. Chad Carroll, whom you saw earlier. He is also associate professor in the Department of Health and Kinesiology. Dr. Carroll's academic work centers on tendon biology, and his long-term goal is to determine the mechanisms contributing to poor tendon health and to discover approaches for normalizing tendon function. Dr. Carroll's work also spans the translational spectrum from molecular biology experimentation to test disease mechanisms, all the way to human clinical trials to test treatment efficacy. He too has been supported by external grants from the National Institutes of Health, and is also supported for an active clinical trial from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and he will be speaking to us about nutrition and physical activity in the context of tendon biology. And finally, Dr. Wayne Campbell, who is professor from the Department of Nutrition Science. Dr. Campbell's research is dedicated to evaluating how nutrition and exercise can be used as effective tools to positively affect metabolism, health, and functional well-being of people as they progress through the life course. His current research focuses on assessing the effects of healthy dietary patterns and protein-rich foods on nutrimetabolomics, cardiometabolic disease risk factors, and indices of well-being. Dr. Campbell has a numerous service experiences serving on research advisory panels for the National Institutes of Health, USDA, NASA, and so on. He was a member of the United States Departments of Health and Human Services Agriculture and Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and he's a Health and Human Sciences Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee as well. And he will be speaking to us about diet and physical activity as guidelines for diet and physical activity in aging adults. That will be our panel. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. Richards to the podium.
Okay, thank you so much. This is our clicker. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very humbled to be one of the presenters of people who I have described as rock stars in the field of nutrition and physical activity. So I feel I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I want to start by clearly sharing that I am the messenger, that Heather Eicher-Miller is the principal investigator in nutrition science on what I will be presenting today, and she was the nutrition lead on this project. I'm the physical activity lead. This is data we're presenting from a previously funded R21 from NCI, and then I will end by telling you a little bit about the R01 we currently have under review. This was a very complex study that we undertook, so please note we had a very strong team behind us. We worked with distinguished professors in computer engineering to help with the modeling that we did, a very strong statistics team, and amazing graduate students. So we've heard a little bit about this, but it's no surprise that chronic conditions, including obesity, heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, are very prevalent in our society, and that prevalence increases across aging. And unfortunately, studies consistently show that we're unfortunately moving in the wrong direction when it comes to controlling these chronic conditions. Further, we know very clearly that both diet and physical activity are independently associated with not only reducing risks of these chronic diseases, but also managing symptoms of these chronic diseases. So much so that we have national dietary guidelines, national physical activity guidelines. But we also know that timing is important when it comes to human performance, activity, and health, which is one of the reasons why we are looking at the timing aspect of lifestyle patterns. And so when we think of timing, we often think of sleep and the sleep-wake cycle. And this circadian rhythm controls way more than just when we go to sleep. It influences when our peak alertness is, it influences our metabolism, influences some of our body regulations such as blood pressure and so forth. So timing is also very important with lifestyle. And so that's what we sought to look at. And so the work that we've done is to create a methodology that examines how does time matter when it comes to when we are active and when we eat? And is that timing important with health outcomes or health indicators, which we refer to them to? So this study used data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This is from 2003 to 2006 when N. Haynes had the waist-worn actigraphs, so we used that data. N. Haynes is very powerful for looking at some of this research, particularly because there's objective measures of physical activity and objective measures of the health outcomes that we were interested in. So participants in N. Haynes go through, if you're not familiar, go through an extensive examination, fasting labs, and physical examinations. So when we're looking at weight, for example, it's not based on self-report data. Same with physical activity. So it was a very rich data set for this project. A caveat with N. Haynes that I want you to think about as we're presenting this work is that it's cross-sectional. So this is just a first step in what we hope to continue to look at in the future. For this first study, we looked at US adults. It's a nationally representative sample, ages 20 to 65, non-pregnant women, but also men. And in particular, because we know pregnant women have different lifestyle patterns, younger people, especially children, and older adults have different lifestyle patterns. So our first goal is to create this methodology and then to be able to look at it in other participations. To be included, they needed to have one valid dietary recall and at least one valid weekday of physical activity data, because we also know that patterns differ between weekday and weekend. We have now also looked at patterns in weekend and identified those differences, but what I'm going to present today is based on weekday physical activity. And so you can see when we looked at the nutrition patterning alone, we had close to 18,000 participants. When we narrowed it down to look at the physical activity, that data set is smaller, so we have about 1,800 participants in that. So this this project, as I said, is based on creating a methodology. So we wanted to know, can we create patterns that account for amount of energy, account for intensity using activity counts from the accelerometers, then looking at frequency and including time. So can we create a temporal pattern? And if yes, are those temporal patterns related to health outcomes? Okay, so now I have to look at some notes because this is where, in my mind, it gets complicated, and I'll tell you partly why. I am a nurse. I am very practical and applied in the work that I do, and I look at physical activity, and so Roger's talk was very inspiring when I was listening to it, because I look at physical activity as like one of the only fountains of youth that we have available to us. And so the work that I do is about keeping people out of the hospital, keeping people off medications. So very, very practical and applied. However, we needed to get into some, in my mind, pretty intense patternings and statistics to figure out the timing proportion of this. And this patterning was done with computer engineering and statistics taking the lead in the methodology. And I have to give props to Dr. Eicher Miller, who is brilliant when it comes to the research that she does, and she really embraced this methodology as well. And so we used dynamic time warping, and it's an elastic distance measure to find optimal matching between two pairs of data. And we were looking at pairs of eating occasions and pairs of physical activity occasions. And then we used what's called kernel K-means algorithm to partition our time series, so we had 24 hours of data, into mutually exclusive clusters. So participants in one cluster had physical activity and dietary patterns that were similar. And so as you can see here, participants 1 and 3 have similar diet and physical activity patterns. So these folks would be clustered together, whereas the participant 2 and participant 4 are likely in separate clusters. And then we wanted to say, if we identify these clusters, how are these clusters related to objective measures of health? And so we looked at obesity, body mass index, waist circumference, blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, and also fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C, which is a long-term measure of glucose, and then blood lipids as well, triglycerides and total cholesterol. And the great thing with NHANES is these are all objective measures, which are expensive to get, so we were able to capitalize on that. And when we were making these, looking at these associations, it's important to keep in mind we accounted for covariates such as age, sex, poverty index ratio. When weight was not one of the outcome variables, we accounted for weight. We accounted for accelerometer wear time and also energy misreporting. So what did this look like? So I'm going to show you a couple different heat maps of the patterns that were developed. So these 4 heat maps are of the nutrition patterns, the diet patterns. And so we identified 4 what we're calling meaningful patterns. And I think this will pop up. Oh no, it doesn't, so we're gonna go back. So let me describe these patterns for you. So we are describing cluster, I don't know if this actually will show you, okay, well, kind of. So cluster 2 we're describing as having the lowest dietary quality pattern. So across the x-axis here is time from 0 to 24, and the y-axis is fractional amount of energy intake across time. And so you can see there is no moderation here, and in fact, so this is like all of your energy intake happening at certain periods of time. And the darker the color in this heat map, that's the more participants that were in the cluster. So these guys we classify as the worst. This pattern 1 is also like the second worst, because you can see there's upwards of 60% or higher of energy intake happening at one time point. Whereas pattern 4, we like these guys from a public health perspective. There's moderate energy intake happening across time. So it looks like pretty much no more than one eating occasion had this 40% of energy intake. So this would be described as a moderate dietary pattern. And so when we looked at just the nutrition dietary pattern related to health outcomes, we found that folks in this cluster 4 had lower body mass index, lower waist circumference, and lower odds of obesity compared to the other patterns. We also looked at physical activity separately. And so these are the 4 physical activity patterns that we identified. And so here you can see, again, time across bottom, absolute, so physical activity counts across the top. You can see cluster 1 had, oh geez, it doesn't matter. Cluster 1 had low physical activity pretty much throughout the day. So this is like 9 a.m., it kind of increases a little bit, never reaches very high, and then starts to decline here in the evening. Versus cluster 2, which had a slowly ramping up their physical activity, and then slowly ramping down their physical activity, but this is considered like episodes of higher intensity activity here, versus cluster 3 that kind of slowly ramped up. So these might be, again, it's cross-sectional, and we can't infer a lot about this activity, but these might be more like people who work nights, for example, that are more active in the evening. And then cluster 4, again, some lower intensity activity, but definitely higher than cluster 1 that peaks around midday. And so what we found when just looking at activity in relation to the health indicators, that cluster 2 and cluster 3, both that had some higher peaks of physical activity, had better relationships with health outcomes. Good news, like these are things that we tend to know regardless. But then we wanted to look at, so what happens when we look at both a participant's diet and their physical activity across time in one day? What do those patterns look like, and how is that related to health outcomes or health indicators? So I can't show you a heat map per se because we're overlapping 2 health behaviors together, but I can show you what the patterns look like in relation to the socio-demographics of the participants. So here you can see cluster 1 had moderate energy intake and high intensity activity earlier in the day. It's also worth noting that these were our youngest participants and had the highest % of male participants. So this kind of follows the trend with what we expect to see when we're looking at physical activity from a population level. Cluster 2 had earlier energy intake. They had low intensity activity throughout the day. This was our oldest population and had the lowest %. So this was mostly women in this sample. Cluster 3 had moderate energy intake and high intensity activity, but their activity was later in the day. And then cluster 4, later and very high energy intake. So these people were eating possibly like one meal towards dinner or later. And also moderate activity, but also later. And so what we found is, when looking at both diet and physical activity temporal patterns, people who were in this cluster 1 or cluster 3, so moderate energy intake and higher physical activity, whether that activity be in the morning or in the evening, so a high peak of physical activity, they had the lowest body mass index and the lowest waist circumference. And we saw a similar pattern when we were looking at blood lipids. And so the folks specifically in cluster 1, cluster pattern 1, had significantly lower total triglycerides and significantly lower triglycerides and total cholesterol compared to the other clusters. So what does that mean? So given that we sought to create a methodology, I feel pretty confident that we can say we were able to create temporal dietary patterns, temporal physical activity patterns, and then what we're calling joint temporal dietary physical activity patterns, and relate those to health. And so when we looked at the joint patterns together, we found the most meaningful and stronger outcomes or health relationships with health outcomes. And so we know that diet matters, physical activity matters. We know more about the timing of diet and health outcomes. We don't know much about the timing of physical activity and health outcomes from a population perspective. So this research is starting to inform that, but it's just the beginning. So these are the clusters that we looked at. So no surprise, having moderate energy intake throughout the day is good for us, and having some bursts of activity is good for us as well. It's question time, but I'm going to just take 1 second to tell you a little bit about the R01 that we have under review now, because we know that it's just not diet and physical activity that matter to health. We know that sleep matters also, and when you have the accelerometry data, you can also start to look at patterns of sleep, which we are proposing to do. We also are proposing to look at our patterns to see if they hold up longitudinally, starting with the AARP data set, which has accelerometry included in it. And then looking at our methodology with NHANES with both children and older adults to see if the methodology holds and how the patterns differ. And now we have time for questions.
Thank you for the talk. So I have a question. So if I understand correctly, the best dietary patterns is that if we eat evenly throughout the day. And so there's also an idea of intermittent fasting. So does it tell us that maybe it's not a good idea to have that kind of dietary fasting pattern?
Well, we're going to let Wayne talk about that when he gives his talk. We weren't able to necessarily pull that from the way that this data was collected, but we do know there are some health benefits, especially with weight loss related to intermittent fasting, but I'm not an expert to be able to give you a solid response. Sorry.
Hi, I loved your presentation. One of my main questions was for this new R01, are you planning to do a mixed methods or qualitative and really get to why people are engaging in these kind of behaviors? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so that is super important. We are still proposing to do what we're calling, an observational study, looking at data, nationally representative data that's been previously collected. Long-term next steps to get at really looking at any cause and effect would be looking at some of the methodologies that Dr. Fielding reported and really assigning people temporal patterns to follow, but we don't know near enough yet to go that route. I love you, Waylon.
I love the presentation. So I was looking at the control variables, and I wonder, what do you think social roles can play in shaping people's pattern of the dietary practices in their physical activities? Do you think that will be mattering for their exploration of the relationships? Thank you.
So, socioeconomic status, is that?
Social roles, like parenting role or caregiving,
for sure. Yes.
or yeah.
100%. Absolutely. So we weren't able to dive into that with the data set that we have, but we absolutely know, which is one of the reasons why we didn't include pregnant women, because we know that their pattern's going to be different. We saw a little bit about that, though, when looking at gender. And when you look at gender, you can also extrapolate, social roles that follow each gender. But it definitely is something very important to consider, especially when the research gets to making recommendations for how people should be active or, eat. Even as a student, that social role influences your health behaviors, even though we tell you that it shouldn't and you should put those first. We all know that you probably don't get enough sleep and you might not be as active as you should and so forth. So it's very important to consider. You're welcome.
I'm sorry, Raymond.
It's good for her. She's getting short bursts of activity.
Thank you for that talk. I was curious about how intense was the intense physical exercise. So was it just a measure of physical activity on one day, or are we averaging across a week?
So that's important because both matter. So this was just across one day. And the tricky thing is also along with the definitions of sarcopenia, the way people describe physical activity intensity, we don't have a clear standard. So especially when you're looking at accelerometry data, depending on who created the methodology, something might be considered moderate intensity, something might be considered light intensity or high intensity. So that's why we used counts. So the counts are just the actual movements on the accelerometer instead of trying to classify it into an intensity category. So what we are able to say is the more movement, the better. And we technically know as those counts get higher, the intensity of the activity is getting higher, but we did not break down those cut points. But light intensity activity is still extremely beneficial, especially if you're starting from sedentary behavior. But from a physical activity standpoint, more is better, higher is better, but anything is better than none.
Thank you.
Last question from anybody but Wayne. All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right. So thank you, first of all, to the organizing committee, Chad and Wayne, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Fielding, for coming to visit Purdue and for the wonderful talk. Hopefully there will be slides. Perfect. Thank you. My name is Bruno. I'm a physical therapist, and the focus of my laboratory is on peripheral artery disease, developing therapeutic strategies to restore physical function in patients that suffer from PAD. And over the almost 9 years now, we've been focusing on the potential therapeutic benefits of heat, using heat stress, particularly heating the lower body, as a way of restoring muscle function and ultimately physical function in patients that suffer from PAD. Before I tell you about heat, I would like to just describe what is peripheral artery disease. PAD is fairly common. It's one of the most common manifestations of atherosclerosis. If you look at the image on the left, you see those yellow plaques. This is the buildup of plaques in the arteries of the lower extremities, leading to poor blood flow to the legs and causing sensations such as the one displayed there, which is cramping and aching when you're walking. This is estimated to affect about 230 million people worldwide. We know this is largely an underestimation. These patients have greater functional impairment and faster rates of functional declines than individuals that do not have PAD. In the primary way, the first-line therapy to deal with that is supervised exercise. This is exercise in a cardiac rehab setting that entails usually performing high-intensity bouts of walking, right? So you walk into the point of maximal pain and rest until the pain subsides. Unfortunately, this is very rarely prescribed. Very few programs are available. And even when you offer that at no cost, very few participants will actually uptake and actually adhere to this exercise program. So there is clearly a need for new therapeutic interventions to restore physical function in these individuals. And our focus, as I said, thus far has been on heat, using heat stress as a way of potentially improving the ability of these patients to walk and perform their daily physical function. This idea of heat started largely in Japan. I'm showing you one example here in a mouse model of peripheral artery disease. This work by Akazaki and colleagues was done in mice. There are no very good models of PAD in rodents. The way we do this typically is surgical occlusion of an artery. So we acutely occlude blood flow. We cut it off by restricting blood flow to an artery, causing hind limb ischemia. So it's a model of ischemia-induced muscle damage. And that's what they did here. They ligated the femoral artery of these mice, and they randomly allocated them to receive a control regimen or being placed in a sauna. So they were placed in a far infrared dry sauna for mice, 41 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes, and then 34 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes, once daily for 5 weeks. And at the end of that, they harvested a muscle in the calf, the gastrocnemius muscle, and counted the number of capillaries in that tissue. And what you see in that panel at the bottom, compared to the control animals, there was a substantial increase in the number of capillaries, angiogenesis, as we call it, the formation of new capillaries in the tissue. And that effect was largely eliminated, abrogated by concomitant administration of a non-selective nitric oxide synthase inhibitor called L-NAME. So this is the first piece of evidence in peripheral artery disease that repeated exposure to heat stress may promote angiogenesis, partially due to activation of this nitric oxide signaling pathway. Okay? We thought that data was pretty interesting, and we decided to perform some initial studies in healthy young individuals to test whether that would be true for human skeletal muscle. So we collaborated with Dr. Tim Gavin's lab, and this is work by Raymond Kim, a wonderful graduate student in the lab. Instead of sauna, we used these water circulating pants, which was practical for what we wanted to do, which is treat one side of the one leg with heat while the other leg served as a control. So you see these hoses coming out of the pants. We could selectively run water at different temperatures to perfuse either side. So each individual served as its own control. One thigh was heated, the other thigh was not heated. And this was done 5 days a week for 8 weeks. They had to come to the laboratory and sit down for an hour and a half while the one leg was being heated while the other thigh received the control intervention. And one of the primary outcomes we were interested in was ENOS expression. And when we did that using Western blotting, we saw that already at 4 weeks, but predominantly at 8 weeks, there was, as demonstrated by Akazaki and colleagues, an upregulation of the content of ENOS in the tissue. So we took biopsies, Tim took biopsies at baseline 4 weeks and 8 weeks, and this is the mixed tissue content of ENOS. We also looked at capillarization. You see on the top there a cross-section of a representative cross-section of the muscle that was incubated with antibodies against, hard to see, the purple line there is dystrophin, the green is myosin heavy chain 1 to differentiate in between fast and slow twitch fibers, and the red ones is CD31, which allow us to detect the capillaries. So we counted the number of capillaries in the tissue, and the index I'm showing you here is called capillary to fiber perimeter exchange index, which takes into account, among other things, the perimeter of the fiber and the sharing factor of these capillaries. And the comparison we're making here is the white symbols, so the non-filled squares with the black squares, and what you see is that already at 4 weeks, and once again, more clearly at 8 weeks, there was an increase in the CFPE index, compatible once again with the data in mouse and the mice, showing that there is an increase in capillarization in the tissue, but now in humans. One very interesting piece of data that came out of this project, Raymond Kim was an expert in muscle strength assessment, and he wanted to assess muscle strength here, so he did that using an isokinetic dynamometer. This is the peak torque achieved following 3 maximal contractions of the knee extensors here. Once again, the controlled thigh is on the left, the heated thigh is on the right. And we saw, and I believe this is one of the first reports in the literature, indicating that repeated exposure to heat stress, even if it's local, seems to increase muscle strength. You know, this is a slight yet statistically significant improvement in muscle strength in these individuals. It's important to note that these are healthy young individuals here from our community. Okay, so we're very excited about these earlier findings in healthy young individuals and began translating those findings to peripheral artery disease. And the first project we worked on was in a mouse model of PAD. So we, using that model that I described earlier, we got 32-week-old C57 mice. We fed them a high-fat diet, so they would have risk factors for peripheral artery disease, such as hypercholesterolemia, hyperlipidemia, and metabolic syndrome. And then we performed this femoral artery ligation. We just cut blood flow through their femoral artery to induce high limb ischemia. We randomly allocated the animals to a control group or one that received heat therapy. We did not do sauna here. We developed a jacuzzi for mice. So we put them in a flat bottom restrainer and immersed their lower body in warm water. So they were there 30 minutes a day, 6 days a week for 3 weeks. And at the end of that, throughout that process, and at the end of that, we measure a number of outcomes. One that I think was particularly interesting was body composition. So we used a device called EchoMRI to look at changes in lean mass and fat mass across the duration of the study. So lean mass is on the left, fat mass is on the right. The control animals is the open circles. The heat therapy treated animals are displayed with the black symbols. Not a whole lot of changes in lean mass, but fat mass, you see a very contrasting phenotype there that The animals in the control group continuing accruing fat because they were still on a high-fat diet, but the animals in the heat therapy group stopped accumulating fat. At the end of these 3 weeks, there's a 5-gram difference in fat content in these animals. So at least in this mouse model of PAD, these repeated exposures, episodic exposure to heat stress, alters fat metabolism so that there is a major difference between the groups within 3 weeks. We were obviously interested in muscle strength and muscle mass. So what you're seeing here is the relative muscle mass of the extensor digitorio longus, which is a muscle in the front portion of the leg, sitting underneath the tibialis anterior muscle. We looked at the relative mass, so this is muscle mass relative to body weight, and we also measured muscle force using an isolated muscle testing system. So you have 3 groups here. The lean shunt-operated control is the LSO. That is the healthy control animal, just as a reference of what normal would look like. The obese animals with the ligation that receive the control treatment, and the last bar is the animals exposed to heat therapy. So as you can see, the relative muscle mass declines in the obese animals with hind limb ischemia, and heat therapy, exposure to heat, nearly reverses that effect. The relative muscle mass in the heated animals is not different than in the LSO. A similar scenario, although to a lesser extent, occurs with maximal strength. We did a force frequency relationship in these animals, and the maximal force is displayed in that graph. There is a decline in force development in the controls, and that is restored at least partially by exposure to heat therapy. So another piece of evidence that heat alone may potentially influence muscle phenotype and function. So the next step was beginning to translate that to humans, to patients with peripheral artery disease. And we performed a small-scale randomized clinical trial involving about 34 patients that are symptomatic. So we brought them to the laboratory and performed some baseline assessment. And then we provided them with these pair of these water circulating pens and a water pump, as shown in this image here at the bottom. The water pump was instrumented to run water at 33 degrees Celsius in the sham group and 43 degrees Celsius in the heat therapy group. So this was based upon our initial pilot data. They were sent home with these devices. They were asked to do this 90 minutes a day, 7 days a week for 8 weeks. Okay, and at the end of this period, they came back to see us for reassessing some of these physical function and other parameters. It's hard to summarize the 3-year clinical trial in a single slide, but that's what I'm doing here. So when compared to the sham treatment, this repeated exposure to heat therapy resulted in an improvement in 6-minute walk distance. The primary outcome in this trial, as well as most clinical trials with peripheral artery disease, is the 6-minute walk test. So you see this graph representing a change in 6-minute walk distance from baseline to the 8-week follow-up in individuals exposed to a sham, a control treatment, or heat therapy group, or a heat therapy. The ones that received heat therapy display an average of 24 meters increase in walking distance, which is known to be clinically meaningful for this patient population. Contrary to our hypothesis, we saw no changes in vascular function. Measures of skin blood flow, bulk blood flow to the leg were not altered by the regimen. And there was also, quite intriguingly, no changes in perceived quality of life in these individuals, despite the improvements in physical function. This here was the foundation of our ongoing clinical trial, much larger clinical trial, now involving 106 patients over the next couple of years to definitively establish whether repeated heating of the legs improves physical function and hopefully quality of life in this patient population. So I'll stop there before I get a red card. I'd like to thank the students that conducted this work. Raymond Kim did most of the work I showed you today. Jacob Moreau, Susan Rose, a graduate student in the lab. Tim and Shihwan were great collaborators and our partners at school at IU, at the Vascular Surgery Division, and our sponsors. So thank you again for the invitation.
So this is really nice work. And my question is, so it looked like you saw maybe a 24 meter change in the 6-minute walk. How is that comparable to some of the trials that have just used exercise and physical activity? Is it about the same? Or?
Yeah, the data is emerging now in the large scale. There's newer data from Mary McDermott's lab indicating that home-based exercise seems to promote a greater change in 6-minute walk distance than supervised exercise, which is quite intriguing to me. But the overall improvements, if I recall, are about 30 meters, so a little bit more than that. But keep in mind, this was 8 weeks only. We're now extending the duration.
Yeah, and I wonder about the sort of self-reported quality of life measures in 8 weeks. Maybe sometimes we've seen that sort of takes a little bit longer for people to be able to sort of feel like they're doing better.
Yes, yeah, it's a great point. And the work that Mary did also revealed something similar to what we showed here, which is a dissociation between improvements in physical function and quality of life in this population. They are walking better, they have substantially better performance on the 6-minute walk test, and still they perceive their quality of life as unchanged, following supervised and home-based exercise interventions.
Oh, my question is that does the type of the heat matters if the temperature is the same? Like, for example, my car is usually parked outdoors during the summer. When I got into my car, it's pretty hot. Can I persuade myself that I'm actually doing a heat therapy and it's good for my health? So that's my question. Thank you.
It's a great question. I don't think there is enough evidence yet to pick one out of the many therapeutic interventions that you can do with heat, ranging from, I think the most commonly used ones are still water, right? Immersion in water and sauna, with some other more practical for home-based interventions emerging. So it's early to tell whether any of these, or sitting in the car in the summer is a reasonable idea. Ultimately, changes in core temperature will be the ones driving some of these manifestations, we think, if you're talking about whole body systemic levels. But as you saw, we demonstrated some beneficial effects with local heat therapy as well. Heating just a segment of the body seems also to be beneficial.
I was just curious with your participants who had to wear these pants for 90 minutes a day, each day, right? How much did they adhere to that? Or, was there, some people who didn't?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this, now we didn't measure that in that particular trial. We just asked them to report once a week what they did, right? And everybody lies. We are now hiding a timer inside the pump. And we're estimating, real compliance with the treatment. And it's too early to tell. We have about only 32 participants in the trial enrolled. But on average, thus far, the compliance is about 70% of the prescribed regimen, which is worse than this because it's 12 weeks of 90-minute sessions every day. I think this population is known to be sedentary. So depending on who you're talking to, they say it is feasible. But the ones that are still in the active range, that are still working, perceive this as difficult, a regimen that they would be unlikely to continue if they were not in the study. So it really depends on who you're talking to. It is a very strict regimen, and our hope is to define a concept and later on refine it to see what's the optimal dose for eliciting benefits.
Thank you. Great presentation. Really interesting work.
Thank you.
And that was kind of my question. You kind of touched on it. Is what's a long-term maintenance look like? Are people really going to want to do this daily to see the benefits forever, or you would hope to kind of see if you could reduce that, need to, like you said, optimal dose? So
yeah. I think that's what we're walking towards, is eventually define a optimal regimen. Well, just like exercise or medication, if they stop doing, the effects will go away. There's reversibility, right, in all of these interventions. So they would have to continue that. It would have to be a habitual treatment for them to. Now, what is optimal? What is the most adequate modality? Sauna, equivalent to getting in a hot tub or using these hot pants. We don't know that. So there's a lot of work to be done to define what is the most adequate stimulus to to cause improvements in physical function.
I was curious, so as you said, you've been, been fairly sedentary individuals thus far, but could this possibly, have you thought about whether it might be adapted to, for example, people who were normally very active, but then have some sort of injury, that this could be part of a therapeutic plan to sort of get them back to their previous level of activity?
Yeah, great point. Absolutely, yeah. And we're also beginning to get into a population that is more active. You know, Susan Rowe is here. She's doing a small trial here in the community with people that are healthy, I should say healthy, but older adults that do not have peripheral artery disease and obviously have much better physical function compared to those individuals. So we'll see what that data shows, but there is potential for this to be therapeutic even for individuals that are active, or a situation that, like me, recovering from an injury, that can certainly be beneficial. Last question.
So it's always inspiring to listen to your talk. As I learned from your exercise physiology course, capitalization could increase by the endurance training. And do you think that the increased capillaries density from heat therapy is due to a similar mechanism from the endurance training?
That's a great question. We know a lot about, what are the possible triggers of angiogenesis with exercise, but we don't know much about how heat does it. I think there's some, obviously, factors that are triggered by exercise, such as mechanical activity and some other factors that are not there with heat therapy. Most of the data points, even in isolated cells, points toward an independent effect of heat on the so-called heat shock proteins. And there's some evidence that activation of these heat shock proteins, particularly one of the members of this very large family called heat shock protein 90, may be the initiating signaling mechanism to activate the downstream pathways that lead to angiogenesis, such as VEGF signaling. So I think it's in its infancy yet. It's too early to tell how heat does it. But one response that we see across, several species is this activation of heat shock proteins. And I think it's becoming more clear that eNOS is also activated, ranging from endothelial cells, isolated vessels, isolated muscles in humans now. So it involves probably these two. Thank you. Thanks again for the invitation.
Well, I wish I had gone first, because then I follow up all these good presentations here. Set my timer so I don't go over. All right, so I'm going to change gears a little bit and focus on tendons, which is, from my experience, I've been researching tendons for about 20 years, and it's not always thought of in context of aging, and there's not a lot of research. So I've tried to approach this as somewhat of an educational presentation with also some data interspersed, and hopefully not go over and get, as Bruno called it, the red card. But to give you a little background, since not everyone's familiar with tendons, the general, I guess, thought process from the folks that don't research tendons is a lot of people have always thought of the tendon as this kind of inert structure. There's, in these older exercise textbooks, it'll say tendon is an inert structure between muscle and bone, which is very far from the truth. But just to kind of give everybody a quick education on tendons, I think we all are aware that the tendon connects muscle to bone. But what a lot of people aren't aware of is that the tendon is contiguous with a bunch of layers of connective tissue that surround the individual layers of our skeletal muscle, all the way down to the single fiber level, which is what is depicted here. This is actually some skeletal muscle where the muscle has been digested away, leaving just the tendon connective tissue, which is all this white stuff here. This right here is where a single muscle fiber would reside. And so when your muscle contracts or when your fibers contract,
the force that's generated in the muscle is transferred through all this matrix eventually to the tendon. So changes in this matrix or the tendon itself can influence physical performance. You can equate it to kind of like a bicycle. Just imagine that your pedals are your muscles producing the force, and that force then has to be transferred through the flywheel or the connective tissue in the muscle to the tendon, which is the chain, to actually turn the wheel. So kind of a conceptual way to look at your tendons. Tendons are actually very, very strong. They can withstand hundreds of pounds of force put on them. And in fact, if you want to volunteer for this particular study, they took a needle and stuck it right into the Achilles tendon all the way through and had the person contract, and it bent the needle. So the things they can do in Europe. So really quick before I forget, I am going to show a couple images of tendon disease that if you're squeamish about that kind of stuff, I guess cover your eyes. But the other thing we don't think about is, we think of tendon injuries, but a lot of people don't think of the fact that the tendon is also really, really important for our musculoskeletal function. Researchers have shown that the properties of your tendon can help you recover from falls better, independent of muscle mass. It affects your running and walking economy. It can directly influence muscle performance and even muscle power output, independent of the actual size and health of your muscles. But what is more important from our lab is that as we get older, the chances of us having tendon problems is much higher. And I guess we could generally understand that tendon injuries increase as we age. And this is not just our leg tendons, this is our shoulder tendons, the tennis elbow kind of thing. And we're particularly interested in postmenopausal women because tendon problems are much higher in there. And we're not necessarily talking about rupturing the tendon or complete ruptures, which is what we commonly see in the news media and stuff like that. So gross picture is coming up. What we're more interested in is what we call tendinosis or degeneration of the tendon. And if you know, this is an individual we worked with a few years ago. This is the Achilles tendon here. And if you compare the right side, which is in pretty good condition here, to the left side, you'll notice it's kind of crooked and swollen. And if we were to look inside that individual, here the tendon has been torn a little bit, not completely ruptured. And this is more often what we see. This is not what you want your tendon to look like. This is swollen and yellowish. You can't see it quite as well in the image here. You want a nice white glistening tendon. So this person has a pretty severe tendon pathology. The other issue that we run into, especially with trying to identify patients to study and things like that, is that in many cases, you can have a lot of underlying tendon degeneration with no outright clinical symptoms. And this is just one example of an individual we worked with at 67 years old. This is your patellar tendon right here. And that's not what it's supposed to look like. It's supposed to be a nice black on MRI image, and it's not supposed to be swollen like that. But this individual had no symptoms of discomfort at all. But his tendon was about twice the size of what it really should be. So what happens to our tendons as we get older? We don't know a lot. There's really not a lot of research, especially in humans, on health or on tendon aging. But we've shown in our lab recently, this is actually currently in review, that age correlates modestly with what we call tendon modulus, or for this talk, we'll just call it tendon strength. And we see a gradual decline in tendon strength as we get older, which makes sense, kind of in line with what we see with muscle. And it's some work actually funded by a pilot grant from CALC here, and something that we're trying to get funded for a much larger piece of work is women in particular. We've been focusing on comparing young women and older women. And these are just 3 measurements that we do in our lab with ultrasound and MRI. I'm not going to get into the methodology or anything like that, but this is the size of the tendon, and you noted that I showed you that the tendon can get swells up as it degenerates. So our older women here in gray have larger tendons, larger cross-sectional areas, possibly indicating disease. We use MRI imaging. The signal that we generate in the type of imaging we do can tell us a little bit about how diseased and disorganized the tissue is, with a higher number meaning more disorganization. And we're tending to see more of that higher signal in our older adults, and we're going to continue to add to this cohort. And then that tendon strength measurement, it's not significant with these smaller sizes, but again, we're going to be adding many more individuals to this, but we're seeing a trend towards a reduction in the strength in the individuals as well, which fits with our other data. So the question that I wanted to address today is whether, or talk to you about, is basically, can we use exercise and or nutrition to influence tendon health? And I'm just going to touch on a couple studies we've done and leave it at that, because we don't have time to go into everything. But there's quite a few preclinical studies now in rodents, very few studies in humans, we count them on pretty much one hand, that have shown that various compounds like glycine, amino acid, various vitamins can actually improve tendon healing. So if you injure your tendon, maybe take some vitamin C. We've shown in rat models, we've published several papers to show that soy isoflavones, which are rich in things like edamame and stuff like that, actually improve tendon properties in a postmenopausal rat model. So I grow edamame in my garden, so I might as well eat it. I'm not postmenopausal, but the point is that these compounds are still beneficial. They've done studies actually in men as well, but we've used the postmenopausal model. And there's a small number of studies now that show that regular exercise throughout your lifespan actually benefits your tendon and reduces your chances of tendon injury. And clinically speaking, exercise right now is by far the best therapy for tendon pain. We have all these other things that we can do, but exercise has been repeatedly shown, even if it hurts when you're doing it, it's beneficial. So the questions that we ask in our lab is, can regular exercise benefit tendon health as we age? Can what we eat impact the tendon? And is there an optimal combination of the two? So we got the next study I'm going to introduce is something that Dr. Campbell and I did together. We just finished a study. Paper's about 90% done. Hopefully we'll get it submitted here pretty soon. But we wanted to see if truly, if we could combine exercise and nutrition, if it would benefit the tendon as well as muscle. And part of the idea came from a study in young adults, which demonstrated that if you consumed a whey protein substance here, which is the black bars, versus a placebo, during an exercise training program, would it have influenced tendon properties? And this is the change in tendon size. And normally in a healthy adult, when you exercise, your tendon gets a little bit bigger. And I know it's kind of opposite of what I said earlier about the disease, but there's different mechanisms going on in disease versus healthy tendons. And the protein diet resulted in more tendon hypertrophy, as indicated by the bars there. So we wanted to take that to older adults and see if we could improve tendon properties in older adults with a combined exercise and diet intervention. And since it was funded by the beef checkoff, we actually had a beef group, and we had, this is the RDA recommendation for protein intake, daily protein intake per kilogram of body weight, and we almost doubled that here in the other two groups. So these are high protein groups. We studied women between 60 and 80 years old through a 12-week weight training program focused on the lower leg muscles. We were particularly interested in the patellar tendon, so we had the subjects do exercise like this and leg press type exercises to work the quadricep muscles. And interesting thing about tendon is that the adaptations are not necessarily equal throughout the tendon. So we look at not just the whole patellar tendon here, but we look at various regions. We call it the proximal, middle, and distal regions. And we do an MRI image and simply just trace around it to see if the tendon hypertrophied. And for the sake of time and just to make it simplistic, I combined the two high protein groups. There actually wasn't any difference between the two groups, so I just put them together. So we have our low protein, high protein group. And not quite significant, but we did see a trend towards an increase in cross-sectional area overall in the tendon. But when we break it down by region, it gets a little more interesting. The exercise itself actually induced hypertrophy in the proximal region of the tendon in both groups. At the middle of the tendon, we actually saw more hypertrophy in the high protein group. And interestingly, we saw a decrease in size in the distal in the control group, and really no change in the protein group, but this difference between the groups was significant. So maybe some trends there. We'll see what happens more in the future, if we can add more subjects or do a further study in the future. If we look at our biomechanical measurements, this is that tendon strength measurement I told you about. This is what we call tendon strain. Basically, how much does your tendon stretch under a given load? We don't want too much strain because then we can injure our tendon. And then stress is basically how much stress is being put on the tendon when we load it. Unfortunately, we didn't see any changes with exercise or diet. And that is actually consistent with a couple studies that have been done in older adults. One of the studies I did as a postdoc, we also did not see any change in tendon biomechanics with training, which is in contrast to younger adults, in which we do see adaptations with exercise. So we do have this issue now where we're still struggling to induce positive adaptations in the tendon in older adults. So right now, I think our next question is really back to this optimal, I think my pointer died on me. Pointer died, is the bottom one. Is there an optimal combination? Do we need more protein or do we need more exercise? What do we need to do there? And hopefully I have a couple minutes left because I do have a few minutes left. Perfect. So not only are we interested in nutrition, we're also interested in how various circulating parameters that are influenced by diet and how they affect the tendon. And again, sorry about the pointer dying here, but and we're specifically interested in patients with diabetes. So I'm switching gears, going from protein nutrition to nutrition with diabetes. And we got interested in this area because patients with diabetes have a much, much higher incidence of tendon problems. And then you combine that with aging on top of that, and you have a kind of a double whammy for our tendon issues. The traditional line of thought has been that, oh, there it goes again. I guess it's just because it's on the screen there. I don't know if I've been pointing at this thing and not actually showing you guys anything, but on the top here, the traditional line of thought is that with patients with diabetes, they have these excursions of elevated blood glucose, and that chronic exposure of the proteins in their body to that glucose leads to the formation of something called an advanced glycation end product. And that top thing is just the chemistry behind it. We don't need to get into that. But what that does on the far right there is that can often form what's called a crosslink or a connection between your collagen molecules in your tendon, making the tendon too stiff. And that becomes problematic from a functional standpoint. This also occurs as we age as well. But what we're particularly interested in is the other mechanism is that these proteins that become glycated with glucose also circulate in our bodies. And we eat them when we eat certain foods. And they elevate and they act on this receptor that's shown in the bottom here. It's called a RAGE receptor of all things. And it activates a whole bunch of bad things in our cells. And it can cause a lot of damage. Well, why we're talking about this because of the diet side of it is that we get a lot of these in our diet, in our Western high-processed food diet, particularly, unfortunately, fried bacon on the far right there. This is the content of that compound in bacon. So when we eat fried bacon, I had a little bit last night on my salad, which was probably not a good plan. So your Jimmy John's sandwich, your meats and all that stuff, we eat it. We get these excursions of elevated AGEs. Patients with diabetes are particularly vulnerable to this. So as my joke here, oops, it didn't work, so I'll skip my joke. Gollum, in one scene, he goes, "Give it to me raw and wriggling, and forget your nasty chips." So I don't know if they had potato chips in Middle Earth, but the point is that eating potato chips, they have AGEs in them because they're fried foods. And what do those AGEs do? Well, they build up in our bloodstream. And if you make them in the lab, here's a solution without AGEs, here's one with AGEs. So imagine your blood looking a little bit browner. It's actually called the Browning reaction. And you may have to hook me because I'm not looking at the thing over there. But so we've done a couple studies in our lab. This is a cell culture study where we took tenocytes and cultured them and treated them with various concentrations of AGEs. And basically, unfortunately, these don't show up too well, so we'll just ignore that. But you'll notice that these numbers here progressively go down the more AGEs we have in our experiment. And this is indication of what we call cell proliferation, or the ability of the cells to reproduce themselves and proliferate, which we need for healing and normal maintenance of the tendon. The more AGEs we have, the less of that goes on. And that can become a problem, and that's become our focus of our lab. So we've taken that cell culture work now, and with some recent funding, we've started moving it into in vivo models, and particularly mice.
This is an obese, of course, an obese mouse. I should put a regular mouse there for comparison. But these mice have high blood glucose, they have weaker tendons, and they have elevated AGEs. And so they're a good model for us. And in one of the first studies we did, and that we're continuing to do in the lab, was we wanted to see if we blocked the ability of that RAGE receptor to work, would it improve the tendon properties in these mice? And we measured two different things, stiffness and this modulus number, so basically tendon strength. Okay, I got one slide left. And you'll notice here's the mice that were treated without the inhibitor. Here's the mice that were treated with the RAGE inhibitor, and you see very large improvements in the strength of their tendons. So hopefully down the road, we may be able to use this clinically to help improve tendon properties by inhibiting that receptor and blocking the effect of those AGEs. So in summary, in that very fast 15 minutes, tendons are very important to our musculoskeletal health in conjunction with muscle. Can't have one without the other, basically. Injuries are common as we get older, and regular exercise and a good diet are actually positive things for our tendon health. So really quick, thank my funding sources. We're very excited. We just received an R01 from the NIH. We just started 3 weeks ago to actually take those mouse studies and human studies and put them on steroids. Well, maybe not steroids specifically, but make them bigger. And obviously, I can't do all this myself, so thank you very much to all the students that have helped with the various studies and my collaborators off campus. And that's all I have. Thank you. That felt like 5 minutes, but.
So I have a very practical question. So it sounds like if you, when you're talking about nutrition and tendons, for example, for vegetarians, it sounds like soy is pretty essential from what you've just said. Would that be an accurate takeaway for those of us who are vegetarians and thinking about this?
I mean, I would say with the only caveat that there's essentially no human studies. So you'd be basing your assumptions almost 99% on animal studies. I certainly wouldn't shy away from it. The other project that we're interested in, we have an R01 in review that we want to for follow up on more of the role of estrogen in tendon health. And I'm getting kind of stuff I didn't present, but the interesting thing we've seen is this kind of conflicting results where losing estrogen as a woman ages is bad for your tendon, but trying to give estrogen back or estradiol back as a supplement actually makes things worse in the tendon.
Regardless of whether it's like from soy, which is a source of estrogen,
No. So I'm talking about like if you're doing hormone therapy, for example. And when we in our rat models, we're actually seeing that if you take the ovaries out, and that's how we reduce estrogen. So it's not the perfect model, right? But if we try to give them estrogen back, it actually makes the tendon even worse. But if we give them isoflavones, it actually makes the tendon better. So it seems like a reasonable conclusion. We just haven't been able to get funding to do like an actual clinical trial with compound. But,
thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you, Chad. I learned a lot about this that I didn't know anything about, and maybe I'm going to say something that doesn't make. But so tendons, my understanding is tendons are pretty avascular, and I'm guessing that proteins in the tendons turn over slowly.
Very slowly.
So I'm wondering, like, for your exercise interventions, maybe is 12 weeks enough time?
Yeah, I think that's quite possible. There's kind of some interesting things about the tendon, and the group out of Copenhagen has done some really excellent work with showing that once we reach maturity around 18 years old, if we don't do anything, meaning if we don't exercise or if we don't injure our tendon, it basically just sits there and does almost nothing. But stimulating with exercise, the same group has shown that you get similar increases in collagen synthesis that you see in muscle with an acute bout. So the tendon just needs to be, it just wants to be done, stretched and stuff. But I think my
thought has been, as I've written the manuscript for that, is it might be more, at least for the protein study, that what we've shown with microdialysis is that when you consume amino acids, the concentrations that actually reach the tendon are much lower than what you get in muscle. So we have to almost think of, okay, 1.4 grams might be good for muscle, but we might need twice that to actually impact the tendon. So, but yeah, I think that definitely there's this paper for lifelong exercise actually benefits the tendon. So it might just be simply that you have to exercise and exercise and exercise. And that's always the interesting, am I running out of time? Last question. I mean, that's the interesting thing about tendons is that they need to be exercised to stay healthy. But sometimes someone will say, well, my tendon's bad because I exercise. Well, you're probably exercising too much, and there's data to support that. So anybody have one last question? All right. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I've been part of CALC for 23 years, and this is just an amazing group. And Ken Ferraro has been at the helm of it for all of those times with me, and it's just thank you. You may not have paid much attention to the symposium cover, but the word nexus is there. And so I would like you to think about what the word nexus means to you. And if you have to, you may Google, but you only get 30 seconds on your phone. I'd also like to unlike the other presentations, which were great and I'm going to be up here at this, be even above the 30,000-foot view. So I will, hopefully that will be acceptable to you. And so we want to talk about dietary and physical activity guidelines in America. And these are, hopefully you know that our federal government is actually investing millions and millions of dollars to try to give us education to help us eat better, be more physically active, to promote health. But ultimately, it's all on each of us individually whether or not we give a darn. So we'll start from there. So the dietary guidelines for Americans have been around since 1980. They are congressionally mandated to be updated every 5 years. And the most recent iteration of them was reported in 2020, and there is currently a scientific committee preparing scientific validations for the 2025. Someone mentioned Heather Eicher-Miller earlier. She is our most recent Purdue faculty member to serve on that committee. And you can see that what I have had the good fortune of having been a member of a scientific advisory committee to the dietary guidelines, and uniquely also to the physical activity guidelines. The process, every third grader knows about the dietary guidelines through the pyramids or through the plates now. But what is not really apparent and appreciated is that there are years and years and years of science that go into something like those educational tools. And in the case of a guidelines, be it physical activity or dietary, each process takes about 2 to 2.5 years. I was on committees for 6 consecutive years doing this work. You'll see that for I picked out for dietary guidelines, but they generally think about this in 4 stages. First of all, coming up with the questions that are of critical importance to be able to inform the federal government on making recommendations for health through nutrition and physical activity, convening scientific advisory committees like I've served on and many others, to do this work, and it takes about 2 years of work. It sounds like it's the committee's work. It's not. It's the federal government having 40 to 70 people, PhD level people, supporting and generating the science information for the advisory committee members to be able to vet and then make recommendations on. Step 3 is to actually write the dietary guidelines. The guidelines are not, I do not do the guidelines. They're done by the federal government. And then finally, implementation of and actually educating people. The guidelines themselves are not for direct public education. They are for policymakers, and they're for industry, and they're for other vested people, but they're not for you or me individually, and except through education initiatives, either through the federal government or other agencies throughout the country. So what are the key guidelines for all adults? You could recite it with me. Eat a healthy dietary pattern as long as you live, and consume nutrient-dense foods and meet nutrient needs to help achieve a healthy body weight and reduce your risk of cardiovascular and other kind of chronic diseases. Everyone has heard that. And one of the things to not do is to eat a lot of high sugar beverages, high-calorie beverages, saturated fats, sodium, and to not overdo alcohol if you choose to do so. How are we doing as a country? Well, on a scale of 1 to 100, the Healthy Eating Index says that we're right around an F in my class. So and if you look on the right side, it goes by ages. Even our youngest children are getting a very low D in what is not what they're eating, what they are being provided to eat. And by the time you're getting up into my age range, then we're doing a little bit better. The question is whether or not we're doing a little better because people finally starting to eat healthier, or because the people that ate the worst are no longer alive. Nutrients of concern specifically to older adults: calcium, vitamin D, potassium, fiber, protein, vitamin D, B12, often unappreciated, inadequate fluid intake, especially for men that don't want to go to the bathroom 5 times during the night. And excess of alcohol intake is very interesting for older adults. There's a group that if you were a moderate drinker, you're either going to drink less, possibly because of recommendations of medical professionals, but there's sort of a bifurcation of alcohol intake, and many older people actually consume more. And with special considerations for older adults to enjoy your food, maintain your dentation, and be cognitively and physically able to still consume foods safely. The physical activity guidelines are comparable in some ways and not in others. They are, again, they are science-based recommendations for health professionals, policymakers, to then put out initiatives to be able to educate people in the United States. One thing I didn't mention about the dietary guidelines is that it is for apparently healthy people. Now think about how that applies to older adults. That means that when I was on the committee, we could not vet any research when the science was, or the nutrition information or science we were vetting was in people that already had cardiovascular disease, people that already had diabetes, people that already had some other chronic morbidity. That's not the case with physical activities. From the time I was on the 2015 committee for nutrition to the 18 committee for physical activity, we had actually shifted to actually take into consideration people that were living with chronic conditions. I'm not talking about hospitalization or acute care or those things, but living with chronic conditions. That was really important. That has not happened for nutrition yet. So there is physical activity guidelines do apply to the general population, including those with acute conditions or chronic conditions. Here's a snapshot. I'm sure everybody has heard that you should exercise moderately at least 150 minutes a week. What you don't know is that that number is the lower range of 150 to 300, and they would really, you can get even more health benefit going above 300 minutes a week. So everybody's got that 150. That's the minimum that you might be doing a good job. The problem is that that's not even attainable for most people. Dr. Fielding very astutely and expertly described the effects of and the importance of musculoskeletal training, and also unique to older adults is balance training. So again, key components, multi-component physical activities, aerobic, muscle, and balance. Determine their level of effort to be able to do this based on your physical activities. And if you can't get 150, try to get 140. And with chronic conditions, be physically active as you possibly can, safely and without exacerbating any problems. So, unlike the dietary guidelines, they've been around, again, like I said, over 40 years, and there's a lot of educational materials on this. The physical activity guidelines have only been around since 2008. They've been updated once. But just a couple months ago in July, they released this physical activity mid-course report. And mid-course means between the every 10 years they've been doing the guidelines themselves. So it's been 5 years since I was on my committee. And again, this is for the policy and other professionals. This is strategies on how to do this, but I'm really excited about this because this is sort of the instructions on multiple levels that affect everybody on how to be able to, and how and where to do physical activity and reinforce the amounts and types of physical activities for older adults, specifically older adults. And this is really, to me, hopeful. I'm really hopeful that this is going to be transformative for how many people approach educating older adults. So let's go back to the beginning, Nexus. Dr. Ferraro, you were the one that was championing this word when we first started. So one definition that I found is a connection or link between things, persons, events, especially that is or is part of a chain of causation. And the word, we haven't really talked about causation, but the experiments that have been, most of the experiments that, for example, that Dr. Carroll was talking about as example, they're randomized controlled trials. They're trying to look for, they can assess causation. For these types of guidelines, there is no focus on mechanisms. The scientific mechanisms are not there. Hopefully the scientific plausibility is there. But if we were, as a committee member, whenever we would start to ask questions that were more science-y, why does this work? The federal government people were saying, no, we're not going to invest our efforts there because we need to know what works. We're not going to really worry about how. But the other important thing, which really struck me as somebody that's been trained in both nutrition and exercise sciences, is that for the dietary guidelines, we specifically were not to look at any literature where there was an integration with other therapies. like exercise. And exercise guidelines was even worse. There was an aversion to even considering how nutrition was influencing exercise. And it was a palpable debate in the committee meetings to make sure that we did not look at anything nutrition when we're talking about physical activity. Now, the government, appropriately and understandably, is keeping those, think of the complexity of the questions you would have to ask and the literature you would have to vet to be able to integrate these. But that's what a nexus is. And we don't know. We know intuitively that if you are more physically active and physically fit, metabolically, your body is going to be primed to use nutrition to better advantage. And we know that if you are eating a healthy diet and perhaps from a sports performance or for older adults, to get the best use of your energy and your nutrients that you consume, that you should be, you want to be physically active. Those are not there. So what we have are, I'll change nexus to complementary. We have the guidelines both say, and this is a quote from one of the guidelines, following a healthy dietary pattern, engaging in regular physical activity, and managing body weight are critical during adulthood. As I mentioned, the DGA references the physical activity and actually gives guidelines as part of their guidelines. They have little outbreaks of physical activity information. The physical activity guidelines referenced diet. The word diet was only used 12 times in 80 pages. No, 150 pages, excuse me. It's not there. That doesn't mean that the government's not paying attention to it, but so scientifically, the DGA and PGA, the physical activities and the dietary guidelines do not integrate diet and physical activity for the assessment and evaluation of research. That hopefully will change with future iterations of the guidelines. And thank you for your time. I'm between you and lunch, I know that, so.
Thank you, Owen. And actually, this is not a question, it's a comment, observation I have, I want to share. And so let's follow the beginning, you talk about, we have the federal government invested a lot to educate people, and we know a lot about we need physical activity, we need better nutrition, but still we are doing very poorly. And so the guideline. So this makes me think about, I'm a social scientist. So what I feel is, and the part of the picture we missed here, you talk about the chain of the causality. And the part of here we miss here is the more root cause of the social factors there. So like you said, we have the guideline, we know it, but why people don't do it? Some people choose it, some people not do it, right? So why? I think that's a social part, social part. It's understand those social factors. It's certainly, I think it's understudied, it's overlooked by this effort. So this is just what I see. I think the CALC is situated here to facilitate the interdisciplinary collaboration from the social scientists, from the more, health scientists, more proximate factors of the health. So I situated here to facilitate the collaboration, to have a better, more fuller understanding about the aging process, the health. I just want to share this thought here.
No, and your point is very well taken and appropriate. From a guidelines perspective, with my experiences, we were really focused on what works. what is the state of our health? What is the state of our diet or physical activity adherence and performance as a nation? But then what works and what should be the recommendations? There's to dive in. My dietary guidelines committee actually started to look at some of the factors that you did, and we were basically told to get back in our lane by Congress, because it's a congressional mandate of the scope and focus of what the committee is supposed to do. So I hear you clearly, and I completely agree. We cannot mandate this. These are guidance and recommendations to go out and and to find out what may help educate people to do it better. Great, but to make mandates that you must do it, the politicians will be voted out of office.
So just to echo that, I mean, socioeconomic status is a big determinant of physical activity participation. I mean, it depends on when you look. If you look across this beautiful campus here, the perception would be that most people are very physically active. The rec center is full. People are active. But if you go to other communities, lower income communities, other places where there's a large population of diverse populations, participation in physical activity is much lower, and overall it's pretty low too.
But that's why I'm really excited about this mid-course report for physical activity, because they were going into built environments, they were going into food deserts, if complement understanding why that and how to be able to get things, and that's why these guidelines themselves are not for the general public. They are for policymakers, they are for community leaders, they are for health professionals, administrators. What we know about as far as the 150 minutes a week and filling half your plate with vegetables and drinking some dairy is one just snippet of the real importance. As one statistic, just to reinforce that, I mentioned that the dietary guidelines are congressionally mandated. The dietary guidelines are not. The dietary guidelines are that because they're congressionally mandated, they are federal policy, unlike the physical activity guidelines. So, on any day in America, there's over 30 million people who are directly influenced by the guidelines for diet because of food assistance programs, WIC, elder care programs, all these other things that the physical activity guidelines are not.
Wayne, I want to thank you for your comments today, and he is the perfect person to integrate across all these presentations, and I just appreciate your perspective. I guess there are a couple of things that occur to me, and one is that I like national guidelines. I like federal expectations, and it's nice to have these universal guidelines and goals. But sometimes maybe programs work better at local levels than at federal levels. I mean, one size doesn't fit all, one size oftentimes fits one. So is there a commensurate interest at state level or county level? Do you see these kinds of guidelines saying, here's how we want to approach integrating physical activity and nutrition at the same time? I'm thinking of Dan Buettner's Blue Zones, and when he took the opportunity to try to impact communities, he didn't try to do it nationally. He tried to take one small community and get them to see both of these, the nutrition and the physical activity. Is there any activity besides Blue Zones?
Oh, absolutely. It's a trickle-down effect, but it's also a grassroots efforts. whether or not it's community, for example, in our dietary guidelines committee I served on, we were looking at the influences of community gardens for nutrition at those types of levels. But those are not the things that ultimately get into the guidelines. They're in the reports, but they're not getting into the guidelines themselves in the snippets of information that you might hear about. We did I was on a subcommittee on acculturation and how to be able to look at, as immigration ramps up in the United States, how to be able to adapt and also be mindful of the recommendations from what we're doing now to be able to get them into culturally appropriate messaging, and that's completely local in many cases. So yes, it is there. In this type of a talk, it's not there, but it is absolutely apparent there. Yeah. And Roger knows. What was the one that in Somerville they did a whole community program? Shape Up Somerville. Yeah. Yeah, Chris Economos, who was a graduate educator, student with Roger and me at Tufts years ago, and is now the dean, I think. But they took and tried to do that at a whole community basis of trying to transform it, and it was quite impactful. So yes. It doesn't work at the federal level other than to provide the types of guidance. The integration and the implementation has to come from locally. Thank you. Everybody have a great day.
Okay, what a wonderful day we have, and thank you all our speakers for the wonderful talks. And I also want to thank all our audience for your great questions, and thank you for your continuous participation and support for CALC event. And finally, and after this, we have open house for CALC, and CALC recently relocated to a new office here. So we want to invite every one of you to explore our new space and talk with your colleagues there. And the open house starts from 12:30 to 2:30. You can just stop by anytime. We have food provided there. So, and hope to see you there. Okay. Thank you all again.